Sarah had always believed in the strength of friendship. Growing up in a small American town, she shared everything with her best friend Jessica. Dreams, secrets, heartbreaks, and even late-night ice cream runs when life felt heavy. By the time they reached their 20s, Sarah and Jessica were inseparable. People often joked that they weren't just friends. They were sisters who had somehow been born into different families. When Sarah met David during college, Jessica was the first person she introduced him to. David was confident, ambitious, and had a smile that could brighten even the darkest day. Jessica laughed the loudest at his jokes, encouraged Sarah to take the leap and date him, and even helped her pick outfits for their dates. Sarah never doubted that Jessica wanted the best for her. David and Sarah's love grew quickly. After graduation, David proposed under the stars one summer night, and Jessica was the first person Sarah called. She cried with joy, hugged Sarah tightly, and promised to stand by her side as maid of honor. On Sarah's wedding day, Jessica smiled with tears in her eyes, holding the bouquet as Sarah exchanged vows with David. Sarah thought she was the luckiest woman alive, marrying the man she loved and having her best friend beside her. In the first years of marriage, life was everything Sarah had dreamed of. She and David bought a small, cozy home, filled it with laughter, warmth, and endless plans for the future. Jessica visited often, sometimes more than Sarah expected, but she never minded. She loved how well David and Jessica got along. To Sarah, it was proof of how perfect her life was, her husband and best friend getting along like family. But slowly, Sarah started noticing subtle things. Jessica's laughter at David's jokes sounded a little too enthusiastic. Her compliments toward him were warmer than casual. And sometimes when Sarah glanced over, she caught Jessica watching David with a look that was hard to define. Part admiration, part longing. Sarah brushed it off. Jessica would never betray me, she told herself. She's like my sister. She wants me happy. What Sarah didn't know was that Jessica had begun comparing her own life with Jessica's. Relationships had always failed. She often went home to an empty apartment, watching Sarah live the life she desperately wanted. A husband's love, a stable home, and a sense of belonging. Slowly, envy turned into desire, and desire into a dangerous thought. Why should Sarah have everything? Why not me? Jessica began crossing small lines. She offered to help David with his work projects, texted him casually, and even stopped by the house when Sarah wasn't there. David, being polite, thought little of it. But Jessica cherished every moment as if it were proof that she was slowly becoming part of his world. And Sarah? She remained blissfully unaware that the two people she trusted the most were weaving a bond that would eventually break her heart. Sarah's life continued to move forward with happiness. Or at least that was what she believed. She woke up each morning to David's smile, went about her work as a teacher at the local elementary school, and returned home to the warmth of their little house. Weekends were often spent with Jessica tagging along, shopping trips, movie nights, or even road trips to the beach. Jessica blended so easily into their lives that Sarah never questioned it. Sometimes, she even thought how lucky she was to have such a supportive best friend. Not everyone gets this kind of bond, Sarah would tell David with a proud smile. You and Jessica are like siblings now. David would nod politely, never saying much, and Sarah assumed it was because he was shy about expressing his feelings. But Jessica wasn't shy. Every chance she got, she tested the boundaries. When Sarah left the room to answer a phone call, Jessica would sit closer to David, casually brushing his arm as if by accident. She began complimenting him on small details: his haircut, his shirt, his work ethic, things Sarah rarely even thought to mention out loud. David felt flattered, though uneasy. He never imagined Jessica's attention was more than friendly. And out of loyalty to Sarah, he avoided thinking about it. One evening, Sarah invited Jessica over for dinner. The three of them sat around the table, laughter echoing through the house as Sarah poured wine into their glasses. At one point, Sarah excused herself to grab dessert from the kitchen. In those few minutes, Jessica leaned forward and said quietly to David, "You know, Sarah is lucky. You're everything a woman could ask for." David froze, unsure how to respond. Her tone wasn't the playful, sisterly one he was used to. It was softer, heavier, filled with an undercurrent of something he couldn't ignore. Before he could reply, Sarah walked back in with a tray of cheesecake, smiling as if nothing in the world could be wrong. Jessica leaned back casually, her expression innocent again, and David wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. As weeks passed, Sarah remained blind to the tension slowly building. She noticed Jessica texting more often, sometimes even at odd hours. Once she asked about it, and Jessica laughed it off, saying she was just checking in about girl stuff. Sarah trusted her, of course. Why wouldn't she? This was Jessica, the girl who had stood by her side through everything. Meanwhile, Jessica's envy deepened. She watched the way David kissed Sarah's forehead when he thought no one was looking. She heard the way his voice softened whenever he called her name. Jessica wanted that tenderness for herself. And the more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself that she deserved it. In her mind, it wasn't betrayal, it was fate. Sarah might have met David first, but Jessica believed she was the one truly meant to be with him. And for the first time, she began to imagine a life where Sarah was no longer part of the picture. The cracks in Sarah's perfect world were small at first, barely noticeable, like hairline fractures in glass. She didn't realize how fragile things were becoming until much later. Jessica continued weaving herself deeper into their lives. She began showing up unannounced, sometimes bringing takeout, sometimes with an excuse about needing advice from David on work or finances. Sarah, ever trusting, thought it was sweet that her husband was supportive of her best friend. She even teased him once, saying, "You're like her big brother." David smiled weakly, the words hitting harder than Sarah realized. One Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was out grocery shopping, Jessica stopped by the house. David was fixing something in the garage, sweat dripping down his forehead from the summer heat. Jessica stood at the doorway, watching him for a moment before stepping in. "You work too hard," she said with a soft laugh, handing him a bottle of water she had brought. David took it politely. "Thanks. Sarah will be back soon, so maybe you two can catch up then." But Jessica didn't leave. She leaned against the workbench, her eyes locked on him. "You know, you don't have to be so formal with me. David, I'm not just Sarah's friend. I'm yours too." David shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight behind her words. "Yeah, of course." But still. Before he could finish, Jessica stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Sarah doesn't see how incredible you really are. She loves you, yes, but she takes you for granted. I notice the things she misses." David froze. He didn't know what to say. Part of him felt defensive, protective of Sarah. Another part felt uneasy, because deep down, he wondered if Jessica was right. Marriage had its stresses. Sarah was often busy with work, tired when she came home, distracted by plans and responsibilities. He knew she loved him, but Jessica's words dug into the quiet doubts he tried to ignore. He stepped back, putting distance between them. "Jessica, this isn't appropriate. You're Sarah's best friend." Jessica smiled faintly, her confidence unshaken. "And that's why I know you so well." Then, as if nothing had happened, she grabbed her bag and left, leaving David shaken in the silence of the garage. That evening, Sarah returned home to find both David and Jessica strangely quiet. She brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion. She kissed David's cheek, served dinner, and told stories from her day, never noticing the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Jessica, however, was far from done. Each little rejection only fueled her determination. In her mind, David's hesitation wasn't a refusal. It was proof he was conflicted. Proof that deep down, he felt something too. And so she began her next move. Instead of competing openly, she decided to play a slower, more dangerous game, one that would make Sarah look careless, and herself appear indispensable. She knew it was only a matter of time before David saw what she wanted him to see, that Sarah wasn't the one for him. Jessica was. The cracks in Sarah's perfect world were small at first, barely noticeable, like hairline fractures in glass. She didn't realize how fragile things were becoming until much later. Jessica continued weaving herself deeper into their lives. She began showing up unannounced, sometimes bringing takeout, sometimes with an excuse about needing advice from David on work or finances. Sarah, ever trusting, thought it was sweet that her husband was supportive of her best friend. She even teased him once, saying, "You're like her big brother." David smiled weakly, the words hitting harder than Sarah realized. One Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was out grocery shopping, Jessica stopped by the house. David was fixing something in the garage, sweat dripping down his forehead from the summer heat. Jessica stood at the doorway, watching him for a moment before stepping in. "You work too hard," she said with a soft laugh, handing him a bottle of water she had brought. David took it politely. Thanks. Sarah will be back soon, so maybe you two can catch up then. But Jessica didn't leave. She leaned against the workbench, her eyes locked on him. You know, you don't have to be so formal with me. David, I'm not just Sarah's friend. I'm yours too. David shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight behind her words. Yeah, of course. But still. Before he could finish, Jessica stepped closer, her voice dropping. Sarah doesn't see how incredible you really are. She loves you, yes, but she takes you for granted. I notice the things she misses. David froze. He didn't know what to say. Part of him felt defensive, protective of Sarah. Another part felt uneasy, because deep down, he wondered if Jessica was right. Marriage had its stresses. Sarah was often busy with work, tired when she came home, distracted by plans and responsibilities. He knew she loved him, but Jessica's words dug into the quiet doubts he tried to ignore. He stepped back, putting distance between them. Jessica, this isn't appropriate. You're Sarah's best friend. Jessica smiled faintly, her confidence unshaken. And that's why I know you so well. Then, as if nothing had happened, she grabbed her bag and left, leaving David shaken in the silence of the garage. That evening, Sarah returned home to find both David and Jessica strangely quiet. She brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion. She kissed David's cheek, served dinner, and told stories from her day, never noticing the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Jessica, however, was far from done. Each little rejection only fueled her determination. In her mind, David's hesitation wasn't a refusal. It was proof he was conflicted. Proof that deep down, he felt something too. And so she began her next move. Instead of competing openly, she decided to play a slower, more dangerous game. One that would make Sarah look careless, and herself appear indispensable. She knew it was only a matter of time before David saw what she wanted him to see, that Sarah wasn't the one for him. Jessica was. Sarah was completely unaware of the silent battle happening behind her back. To her, life was moving smoothly, teaching at school, managing the home, and planning for the future with David. But Jessica had already begun laying down her quiet traps, the kind that didn't look like betrayal at first, but slowly poisoned everything. Jessica started with small comments, seeds planted carefully in David's mind. One evening, while Sarah was preparing dinner, Jessica sat with David in the living room. She glanced toward the kitchen and whispered, Sarah works so hard, but she forgets to slow down. Doesn't it bother you that she hardly has time for you anymore? David frowned, conflicted. He loved Sarah deeply, but he couldn't deny there was truth in Jessica's words. Lately, Sarah had been exhausted, often collapsing on the couch after long school days. Their late-night talks had grown shorter, their romantic dinners less frequent. David didn't see it as neglect, but Jessica's voice made him question things he had never doubted before. When Sarah returned with plates of food, Jessica smiled sweetly, switching the subject to something harmless. To Sarah, everything seemed normal. To David, a subtle shadow lingered. The next step in Jessica's plan came a week later. She invited David to help her with a project at her apartment, insisting it was too much for her to handle alone. Sarah encouraged him to go, proud that her husband was kind enough to help a friend. At Jessica's apartment, things unfolded carefully. She made sure to cook his favorite meal, pouring wine into tall glasses. She laughed at all his jokes, leaned closer than necessary, and listened with an intensity that made David feel important, admired. At one point, when David stood to leave, Jessica touched his arm lightly and said, You don't have to pretend, you know. I can see it. You're not as happy as you used to be. David stiffened, anger flashing in his eyes. That's not true. I love Sarah. Jessica smiled gently as though she pitied him. Of course you do. But love and happiness aren't always the same thing. Her words clung to him long after he left her apartment. That night, lying beside Sarah, he stared at the ceiling, unsettled. Sarah shifted in her sleep, murmuring his name, and he pulled her closer. Yet Jessica's voice echoed in his mind, feeding doubts he had never allowed himself to consider. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully devoted. She talked about future vacations, maybe starting a family, and how lucky she felt to have both David and Jessica in her life. But Jessica was no longer content with being just a visitor in their home or a friend at their table. In her heart, She believed she was meant to take Sarah's place entirely, and slowly she was getting closer to making that belief a reality. The next few months brought a subtle but undeniable shift in the household. Sarah continued her routine, thinking everything was perfect. She never noticed the quiet tension that had begun to ripple through her life. Jessica had mastered the art of manipulation. Every interaction with David was calculated. She knew when to be distant, when to be charming, and when to whisper a line that would stick in his mind. Her ultimate goal was simple: make Sarah seem oblivious and herself indispensable. One evening, while Sarah was out volunteering at the school, David received a message from Jessica. "Can you come over? I need your help with something important." It was casual, almost innocent. David hesitated, glancing at his phone, then shrugged. It's just Jessica. Nothing wrong with helping a friend, he thought. At Jessica's apartment, she greeted him with a warm hug and a smile that made him slightly uncomfortable. Thanks for coming, David. I couldn't have done this without you. They spent the evening together, working on what she called a simple project. But the lines between help and intimacy blurred with each laugh, each shared glance, each touch that lingered a moment too long. David found himself laughing, feeling appreciated in ways he hadn't realized he missed. Meanwhile, Sarah returned home late that night, tired but happy from her day's work. She didn't suspect that while she was busy helping children, her best friend was crossing invisible lines with the man she loved. Jessica's next move was even more daring. She began texting David late at night under the guise of advice or checking in. Her words were subtle, flattering, and designed to make him feel noticed, seen and special, things that Sarah, busy and exhausted, couldn't always give. At first, David ignored the deeper implications. He reminded himself of his love for Sarah, of their shared dreams and promises. But Jessica's persistence chipped away at his certainty. Her messages made him feel important in a way he hadn't felt recently. Slowly, doubts began to creep in, not about Sarah's love for him, but about whether she could fulfill the emotional needs he hadn't even realized he had. Jessica's jealousy of Sarah grew with each passing day. She began imagining a life where Sarah didn't exist, where she could have David all to herself. The thought excited her, empowered her, and fueled her determination. One afternoon, Jessica invited David for lunch at a small cafe downtown. It was casual, just the two of them. Over coffee and sandwiches, she laughed and listened, complimented his achievements, and subtly contrasted herself with Sarah. You know, she said lightly, sometimes I feel like people don't really see the best in us, you know? Like Sarah sees what's there, but maybe not everything. David laughed nervously. Jessica, you know Sarah loves me. She's amazing. Jessica leaned closer, her voice soft, persuasive. Of course she does. But love isn't always enough, is it? Don't you ever feel like something is missing? David swallowed hard, realizing for the first time that he had felt that emptiness, and Jessica smiled, sensing the moment, knowing she was weaving herself into his life in ways that Sarah could never anticipate. And all the while, Sarah remained blissfully unaware that her world was slowly being rewritten, one secret smile, one late-night text, one stolen moment at a time, as weeks turned into months. The tension between loyalty and temptation began to weigh heavily on David. He loved Sarah deeply, but Jessica's constant attention and subtle manipulations made him question his own feelings. Each moment spent with Jessica was intoxicating, her laughter, her compliments, the way she seemed to understand him better than anyone else. One rainy evening, Sarah had stayed late at school for a parent-teacher meeting. David, exhausted from work, lounged on the couch when Jessica called. Hey, David, she said softly. I know you're probably tired, but I really need someone to talk to. He hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late and Sarah wouldn't be home for another hour. Okay, sure, he replied reluctantly. Jessica's apartment was warm and cozy, with dim lighting that made everything feel intimate. They sat close together on the sofa, talking about life, work, and their dreams. David laughed more than he had in weeks, feeling a connection that left him lightheaded and confused. At one point, Jessica reached out and touched his hand, brushing it softly. David, you deserve someone who notices everything about you, she whispered. Her eyes held a vulnerability that tugged at his heart. David pulled his hand back slightly, guilt flooding him. Jessica, this isn't right. I'm married. I love Sarah. Jessica smiled faintly, almost sympathetically. I know you do, but love and attention aren't the same thing, are they? You're always giving to her, but Who's giving to you? Her words hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to remind himself of his vows, but the emotional pull was strong. Jessica had been careful, building herself into his life bit by bit, until now her presence felt almost essential. Meanwhile, Sarah's life carried on normally. She trusted Jessica implicitly, never imagining that her best friend was crossing lines that could destroy everything she loved. She planned a small weekend getaway with David, hoping to rekindle their early romance, oblivious to the fact that Jessica had begun planting seeds of doubt in his mind. Jessica, however, had no intention of letting Sarah's plans interfere. She continued her subtle attacks, inviting David to lunch, sending him friendly texts, complimenting him excessively, and carefully noting the times Sarah was busy or tired. Every small action was part of a larger strategy to make herself appear as a more attentive, understanding, and ideal partner. One evening, David found himself staring at his phone, Jessica's last text lingering on the screen. "You're incredible. David. Sarah doesn't always see it, but I do. I hope you know that." He felt a strange mix of guilt, desire, and confusion. The line between friendship and something more had blurred so completely that he wasn't sure where his heart truly belonged. And Jessica? She smiled quietly to herself, knowing that each message, each stolen conversation, was another step toward her ultimate goal, taking Sarah's place and making David hers completely. Little did Sarah know, the woman she had trusted most, her best friend, Jessica, was plotting to betray her in the deepest, most personal way imaginable. The tension in Sarah and David's marriage was invisible, but it was there, creeping in silently, like a shadow at the edges of a bright room. Sarah remained as loving and devoted as ever, pouring her heart into their home, planning small surprises for David, and cherishing every moment they spent together. She thought everything was perfect, unaware that Jessica's careful manipulation was changing the dynamics of their lives. Jessica, on the other hand, had become bolder. She no longer needed to hide her intentions as much. She had David responding to her in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Her visits were longer, her conversations deeper, and her touch lingered more often. Each time she left David unsettled but drawn in, unable to fully resist the warmth and attention she offered. One afternoon, Sarah had taken a long day off to organize her classroom. She returned home exhausted, eager to unwind with David. But when she walked in, she found the door slightly ajar, the living room lights dim, and Jessica sitting comfortably on the sofa. "Hey, Sarah," Jessica called cheerfully. "David and I were just talking about some work stuff." Sarah smiled warmly, brushing off the small unease that flickered inside her. "Oh, that's great. How's your project going?" David tried to maintain his composure, but even he couldn't hide the subtle tension. He smiled politely, explaining briefly about Jessica's project, but his mind kept replaying Jessica's words, her touch, and the way she seemed to understand him better than anyone else. Sarah, none the wiser, offered drinks and snacks, chatting casually, trying to relax, but Jessica had already noticed how her friend was oblivious, how trusting, and how vulnerable Sarah's love for both of them made her blind. She leaned in slightly toward David, letting her knee brush his accidentally, or so she said. David's heart raced, guilt and desire clashing inside him. That evening, after Jessica left, David sat silently on the couch, staring at the TV but seeing nothing. Sarah, tired, snuggled next to him, pressing her hand to his chest. "You've been quiet today," she said softly. "Everything okay?" David forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just tired. Long day at work?" Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. She believed their love was unbreakable, thinking that trust and devotion could withstand anything. But Jessica had already begun, planting seeds of doubt in David's mind, small whispers of dissatisfaction, hints that perhaps he deserved more attention, more appreciation, and more understanding. Her strategy was no longer about casual visits or friendly texts. It was about positioning herself as the alternative, the one who truly saw him. The subtle shifts in David's behavior began to show. He was more distracted, occasionally distant, and sometimes lost in thought. Sarah noticed, but she attributed it to work stress, never suspecting the real cause. And Jessica? She watched from the sidelines, her plan unfolding exactly as she had envisioned. She had convinced herself that what she was doing was right, that David and she were meant to be together. and that Sarah's love and trust were simply obstacles to be overcome. As Sarah drifted to sleep that night, smiling at the quiet comfort of their home, Jessica's words echoed in David's mind. "You deserve someone who truly notices everything about you." Little did he know, the consequences of these whispers would soon reach a breaking point that would shatter the life he and Sarah had built together. The tension between loyalty and temptation had reached a point where David could no longer ignore it. Jessica's presence, her calculated attention, and the emotional intimacy she offered had begun to wear away at the foundation of his marriage, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. One rainy evening, Sarah had stayed late at the school organizing a fundraiser. David, exhausted from work, settled into the couch, hoping to unwind. Just as he was about to grab a book, his phone buzzed with a message from Jessica. "Can you come by? I really need to talk to someone tonight." He hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late. Sarah wouldn't be home for another hour. After a brief internal struggle, he texted back, "Okay, I'll come." At Jessica's apartment, the air was warm and intimate. Candles flickered softly on the shelves, and a faint scent of vanilla filled the room. They sat on the sofa, talking about work, life, and dreams. Jessica laughed at his jokes, her eyes sparkling with a mix of admiration and subtle seduction. David felt drawn in, though a wave of guilt surged through him. "David," Jessica said softly, leaning closer, "you work so hard for Sarah, for everyone. But who works for you? Who notices all the little things you do?" David opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Jessica's words struck a chord, feeding a doubt he had never allowed himself to consider. He knew he loved Sarah, but Jessica had been careful in showing him the side of attention and understanding that he had begun to crave. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully unaware, believing their marriage to be strong and unshakable. She continued planning small surprises, little weekend trips, and thoughtful gestures to show David her love. She never suspected that Jessica was systematically weaving herself into every part of David's emotional world. The next week, Jessica invited David for lunch. Under the guise of discussing her project, she wore a casual dress that complemented her figure, laughed softly, and shared personal stories to make David feel closer. Every word was deliberate, every gesture calculated to make Sarah appear distant and inattentive in comparison. David felt conflicted. He reminded himself constantly of his love for Sarah and their life together. But Jessica's subtle charm, attention, and understanding made him question whether he was truly fulfilled. He didn't want to betray Sarah, yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Jessica. Back at home, Sarah remained the same loving, trusting wife. She noticed David's occasional distractions but attributed them to work stress. She had no inkling that the woman she trusted most, her best friend Jessica, had become the agent of doubt and temptation in their marriage. Jessica, however, had no intention of stopping. Every small interaction, every casual touch, every whispered word was part of her strategy. She was weaving herself into David's life, shaping his thoughts and emotions in ways that Sarah could never anticipate. And so the unthinkable began to take shape. Sarah's perfect world was slowly unraveling, thread by thread, by the very person she had considered a sister, a confidant and a protector of her happiness. Little did she know, the betrayal she was about to face would come not from a stranger, but from someone she had loved and trusted most. The turning point came subtly, almost imperceptibly. David's interactions with Jessica had shifted from casual to intimate, though still under the guise of friendship. He felt a magnetic pull toward her, an emotional connection he had never anticipated, and one that made him feel simultaneously guilty and alive. One evening, Sarah had stayed late at a parent-teacher conference, and David, exhausted from work, decided to drop by Jessica's apartment. She greeted him with a warm smile and offered him a glass of wine. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "I needed someone to talk to, and you're always so understanding." They sat close, their knees brushing slightly. David laughed at her jokes, and Jessica's gaze lingered longer than usual. "You're amazing, David," she whispered. "Sarah is lucky to have you, but I see you, really see you." David froze, conflicted. He loved Sarah. He had built a life with her, shared dreams and made promises. Yet Jessica's words and attention filled a void he hadn't acknowledged, making him question whether he was truly happy. Meanwhile, Sarah, unaware of the growing tension, returned home later that night. She found the house quiet and David waiting, a faint smile on his face. She kissed him gently and asked about his day, completely oblivious to the emotional entanglement that had begun without her knowledge. Jessica's plan continued methodically. She started leaving small gifts for David, messages that seemed innocent, but carried subtle emotional weight. "Thinking of you. Hope your day went well," one read. Another, "You're so thoughtful. Sarah must appreciate everything you do." Each message chipped away at David's certainty, making him feel noticed and appreciated in ways he hadn't felt in weeks. At the same time, Jessica began creating subtle doubts in Sarah's mind without her realizing it. She would casually mention to David how stressful Sarah's days had been, or how she sometimes forgets to appreciate him. It was all carefully orchestrated to make David view his wife as distracted, tired, or unaware of his emotional needs. One afternoon, while Sarah was preparing a surprise dinner, Jessica called David. "I just need a few minutes to talk," she said. David hesitated, thinking about Sarah, but agreed. That brief conversation was enough to leave him unsettled and longing for Jessica's attention. He returned home feeling guilty, yet strangely energized by the connection he had just shared. Sarah, meanwhile, was happy and unsuspecting, humming in the kitchen as she plated the food. She believed their marriage was strong, that their love was unshakable. She had no idea that Jessica, her best friend, was not only encroaching on her marriage but actively manipulating David's emotions to turn him against her. The stage was set. The emotional foundation of Sarah and David's marriage was starting to crack. Jessica's plan was working slowly but surely, leaving Sarah blissfully, unaware that the person she trusted most was the one who would eventually shatter her world. By now, Jessica had become a constant presence in David's life. Her messages, visits, and casual conversations had created a subtle, persistent pull on his emotions. David felt torn. He loved Sarah, respected their life together, yet he couldn't deny the fascination and connection he felt with Jessica. One evening, Sarah had gone out to meet some old friends, giving David the house to himself. Jessica texted him, "Are you free tonight? I could really use your company." He hesitated for a moment, guilt gnawing at him, but he found himself replying, "Sure, I'll come by." Jessica's apartment was dimly lit with soft music playing in the background. She greeted him with a warm smile and poured 2 glasses of wine. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice soft and alluring. "It's just nice to have someone who understands me." They sat close, their knees touching lightly. Conversation flowed easily, laughter, shared frustrations, and mutual understanding. Jessica's gaze lingered on him, making David's heart race. Each smile, each gentle touch, each attentive word made him feel seen in a way that had begun to feel addictive. Jessica leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "David, you deserve someone who truly notices everything about you. Someone who sees the real you." David froze. His mind raced with guilt, yet the truth in her words struck a chord he couldn't ignore. Sarah loved him, yes, but she had been exhausted, busy and sometimes distracted. Jessica's presence reminded him of what it felt like to be fully appreciated, fully understood. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully unaware. She returned home later that night, expecting an evening filled with warmth and affection. Instead, she found David slightly distant, lost in thought. She attributed it to tiredness, never suspecting that Jessica had quietly begun planting the seeds of temptation and doubt that were now taking root in his heart. Jessica, however, had no intention of slowing down. She began creating situations to make Sarah appear inattentive or neglectful without raising suspicion. She would compliment David at opportune moments, text him late at night under the guise of casual conversation, and subtly highlight Sarah's occasional exhaustion or stress. David, increasingly conflicted, tried to reconcile his feelings. He reminded himself of his love for Sarah, of the vows they had exchanged, and of the life they had built together. But Jessica's influence was growing stronger. Every encounter, every whispered word, and every shared laugh made it harder to ignore the emotional pull she had over him. Sarah, still trusting and devoted, continued planning small surprises, thoughtful gestures, and quiet moments of love, unaware that her world was slowly unraveling. And Jessica? She smiled to herself, knowing that the plan she had carefully orchestrated was working. Sarah's life, her marriage, and her happiness were all quietly being rewritten, one subtle move at a time. The lines between friendship, love, and betrayal had begun to blur, setting the stage for the ultimate heartbreak that would soon shake Sarah to her core. The emotional tension had reached a boiling point, though Sarah still remained blissfully unaware. Every time Jessica smiled at David, every time she offered him understanding and attention, it planted a tiny seed of doubt and desire in his heart. He loved Sarah, but the comparison was becoming inevitable. Sarah, loving but tired and distracted. Jessica, attentive, flattering, and fully present. One weekend, Sarah had planned a small getaway for just her and David. She wanted to rekindle the early magic of their marriage, to remind them both why they had fallen in love. She called Jessica to let her know she wouldn't be available, thinking nothing of it. Jessica's response was warm, understanding. But beneath it lay a subtle sting. "Oh, that's too bad. Maybe another time." While Sarah and David drove to the cabin, Jessica was at home, plotting her next move. She reviewed all the small wins she had accumulated: late-night texts, casual touches, stolen moments, and emotional conversations. Each had built a fragile connection with David that Sarah could not see. Jessica's mind raced with possibilities. Soon, she thought, David would see her as indispensable. At the cabin, Sarah poured her heart into the weekend. She cooked special meals, arranged romantic walks, and shared her dreams with David. Yet, even in the midst of love and warmth, David found himself distracted. Thoughts of Jessica, her voice, her laughter, her subtle attentiveness, invaded his mind. He felt guilty, yet powerless to stop the pull. Meanwhile, Jessica was not idle. She had sent a carefully worded text during the drive. "Hope, you're having fun. Wish I could be there with you, but I know it's your special time." David read it and felt a pang of unease. Part of him wanted to reply, but he knew it would be wrong. Still, the emotional effect was undeniable. By the end of the weekend, Sarah felt closer than ever, but David returned home with a mind clouded with conflicting emotions. Jessica's influence was growing stronger, while Sarah remained the loving, devoted wife she had always been. Jessica escalated her tactics. She began to casually drop hints about Sarah's oversights to David, pointing out small moments she believed Sarah had neglected. Missed calls, tired evenings, and occasional forgetfulness. Each comment was crafted to seem innocent, but its effect on David was profound. Slowly, he began to internalize her words, questioning whether Sarah truly understood and appreciated him. One evening, David found himself alone with Jessica at her apartment, sipping wine, the rain pattering softly against the windows. She leaned close, her voice soft and persuasive. "David, I just want you to be happy. You deserve someone who notices everything about you, who understands every part of you." David's heart raced. He wanted to resist, to remain loyal. Yet her words struck a truth he had been unwilling to acknowledge. A storm was building inside him, a conflict between loyalty and desire, love and temptation. Sarah, meanwhile, remained unaware, planning the next surprise for her husband, thinking their marriage was unshakable. Little did she know, the person she trusted most, her best friend, Jessica, was actively dismantling the foundation of their relationship, one careful move at a time. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable, and the stage was set for the heartbreak that would soon change everything. The final stage of Jessica's plan had arrived. By now, David's emotions were tangled in a web of confusion, guilt, and desire. Each encounter with Jessica had drawn him closer to her, while Sarah remained the loving, devoted wife who trusted both her husband and her best friend implicitly. One evening, Jessica invited David over under the pretense of needing help with a work-related problem. Sarah was attending a parent-teacher meeting at school, giving David the perfect opportunity to spend time alone with her. As soon as he entered Jessica's apartment, the atmosphere felt charged. Candles flickered softly, and soft music played in the background. Jessica smiled, leaning closer than usual, her voice low and persuasive. "David, you've always been there for me, listened to me, understood me in ways no one else ever could. I want you to know how much I appreciate you." David felt a knot in his stomach. He loved Sarah, yet Jessica's words struck a deep chord. Her attention, her praise, and the intimacy they shared in those private moments were intoxicating, difficult to resist. "Jessica, I can't," he said, torn. "I love Sarah. I made vows to her." Jessica reached out, brushing her hand lightly against his arm. "I know, David, and you do love her. But don't you ever wonder if she really sees all of you? Your dreams, your struggles, everything that makes you, you?" David's heart raced, guilt and longing battling inside him. He wanted to resist, but the pull was overwhelming. He couldn't deny the emotional connection he had developed with Jessica, a connection Sarah had unknowingly allowed to form. Meanwhile, Sarah returned home early, hoping to surprise David with a small dinner she had prepared. She walked in quietly, expecting to find the house empty or David waiting for her, but instead she found David and Jessica sitting close together on the sofa. Her heart dropped. She froze, unable to speak, as the truth hit her all at once. The woman she had trusted more than anyone in the world, her best friend, Jessica, was now sitting inches away from her husband, a presence that had clearly crossed lines Sarah had never imagined. David looked up, guilt written all over his face. "Sarah, But words failed him. The damage had already been done. Jessica remained composed, almost triumphant, her subtle smile confirming that her plan had succeeded in drawing him closer to her. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She had never expected betrayal to come from the people she loved most. Her best friend and her husband, the two people who had promised her love and loyalty, had become the architects of her heartbreak. Jessica, meanwhile, felt a rush of satisfaction. Every subtle move, every carefully placed word, every stolen moment had led to this moment. She had claimed the emotional space that Sarah once occupied in David's heart, and she did so without remorse, believing that she had earned it. Sarah turned away, her world shattered as the reality sank in. She realized that trust, love, and devotion could be destroyed quietly without warning, and that betrayal often came from the closest corners of one's life. David stood frozen, caught between the woman he had married and the woman who had silently woven herself into his heart. And Jessica, she simply smiled, knowing that she had rewritten their lives, leaving heartbreak in her wake. The illusion of friendship, loyalty, and love had been shattered. Sarah's life would never be the same again.